Welcome to the University of Alberta's International Week. My name is Yasmeen Abu-Laban, and I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair in Political Science at the University of Alberta. I'm so happy to be with you today to host this session, which is being done in conjunction with a new initiative of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, known as the Collaborative College Community Initiative, or C3I. Now, in an online environment, land acknowledgements can be kind of tricky because we can be located in many different places. But since we are hosting this event at the University of Alberta, let me observe that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on the traditional territory of Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe nations, lands that are now known as Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. The university respects the sovereignty, land, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I'm pleased that the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, through our Collaborative College Community Initiative, is partnering with University of Alberta International to deliver this year's International Week. Now, for 38 years, International Week, or iWeek, has provided a truly fabulous forum to share ideas, to inspire discussions, and to animate debates on current global issues and the solutions required to create a better world. And let me just say that today, I'm really excited that Jamie Liew has joined us as part of this U of A signature event. So just before I introduce Jamie, here's an outline of how today's session will go. Jamie is going to speak for about 25 minutes. And for the question and answer portion of our event, we will display a short URL. It's menti.com. It's at the bottom of your screen. And there's an 8-digit code on the screen. So if you would like to submit questions, please go to menti.com from any device and input the 8-digit code to do so. You don't need to have an app or an account to do this. Our behind-the-scenes moderator will receive your questions and then put them in the queue for me to ask our speaker as time allows. So let me turn to talking about Jamie Liew. It's really an honor to have her here today. She is professor of law at the University of Ottawa, and she is an expert in different dimensions of immigration law as well as statelessness. Amongst others that have relied on her work has even been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. And she's also the host of a wonderful podcast called Migration Conversations. And it's unique in featuring not only scholars or experts and practitioners in the area of migration, but also the voices of immigrants and refugees in all their complexity. Today, her talk is entitled Dandelions and Ghosts, Exploring Socio-Legal Concepts of Citizenship and Belonging. Now, the ghosts and dandelions part refers to her experience in writing two very different recent books dealing with statelessness. So Dandelion, which I have right here, is her first novel, which came out with Arsenal Pulp Press in 2022. This book received the Jim Wong Chu Emerging Writers Award, and it was also shortlisted for CDC Canada Reads in 2023. And it's a very compelling, really engrossing kind of page turner that I really enjoyed reading. Well, in addition to this novel on statelessness, this month her more academic book is coming out. It's called Ghost Citizens, and it's being published by Fernwood Press. That releases on February 22nd, and it can be ordered now from Fernwood Press. I've seen the manuscript of that book, and it's a compelling read that weaves together scholarly analysis with the voices and experiences of those experiencing statelessness. So as I said, Jamie's going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. You can submit your questions at any point. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Jamie with a big welcome to you for being here.
Thank you, Yasmeen, for that wonderful introduction. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Abu-Laban's work, so it's an honor to be here and to be introduced by her. I just want to start my talk by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today as a visiting scholar and guest in Hawaii, and it is part of a larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral grandmother, Papahānaumoku. So just wanted to acknowledge where I'm situated now and to acknowledge the lands that I'm speaking to you from. So I was invited here today to talk to you a little bit about the work that I'm doing, but also to kind of maybe inspire you to ignite the creative in you and what that might do in your own work as you're thinking about research, writing, and thinking through very complex and difficult ideas, and to kind of give you a sense of how I sorted through some difficult questions as I was working through some of my own passion projects. So I wanted to say that, for a long time as a scholar, I focused on my bread and butter, which is immigration and refugee law. And I really focused on a reactive kind of approach to my work. Things would be happening in policymaking, in the news, or being legislated at Parliament, and then I would write about that or react to that and give critiques to the legal policy implications of those things that were happening on the ground in Parliament, in the courts. And as I was, after I received tenure and was on sabbatical, I started to think more, systematically about my work. And it really, I really started thinking about why I got involved in this kind of topic to begin with. And it really had to do a lot with the fact that my father himself and my mother were both migrants. They both immigrated to Canada when they were young adults. And my father especially was born stateless in a country called Brunei. He never had citizenship to any country whatsoever until he was in his late 20s. And it made me think about that his reason for coming to Canada was one that was out of his control, that he was seeking citizenship, and that Canada was one of the countries that responded to his immigration application. So I started looking into the issue of statelessness more, this issue where people are not citizens anywhere, despite the fact that they might have longstanding links or might be living or having permanent residence somewhere, but they might not have, the permanent status of citizenship or feel like they belong wherever they are. And it led me on a journey back to where my parents are from, which is Southeast Asia. And I couldn't really do research in Brunei, the country of my father's birth, because it is not a democratic country. It's quite restrictive in terms of the things you could do there. So I turned to my mother's homeland, which is Malaysia. And there was a vibrant advocacy, legal, and statelessness community there. And I did some research there over 4 months and talked to a lot of people there. I also came back to Canada and reflected on the fact that there are a lot of stateless people in Canada that access the immigration and refugee system, whether as refugees or as persons like my father who came in as an economic migrant, or others who might come as temporary workers, and started looking at those issues a little bit more too. And so the work that I will talk to you about today really comes from seeing statelessness in a variety of contexts, in my family, in legal practice, and in my research. So I wanted to read 2 short excerpts from the 2 books that Yasmeen was kind enough to introduce today, and show you the links and how, and then afterwards I'll talk about how they fed into one another and how this might ignite you if you're writing research papers or thinking through very complex problems, how you might use journaling, creative writing in the ways in which you might want to think through some problems. So I'll preface first that I'll read from Dandelion first, and then I'll explain a little bit about the concept of ghost citizens, and then I'll read from Ghost Citizens. So I'll just say that the book Dandelion is about a young woman who gives birth to a baby and starts to think about her own childhood when her mother disappears at the age of 11. And she is wondering, A, where's her mother now? B, why did she leave? And she kind of revisits the past, her own childhood, and remembers different vignettes of her mother's experience in Canada as a migrant, to explore why is it that she might have disappeared. So the scene that I'm going to be reading from is a scene where the family took a camping trip in near Waterton Lakes Park, if any of you are familiar with that area of Canada. And she witnesses her parents having an argument because her father is really enjoying the landscape and really embracing his life in Canada. And her mother is kind of, doesn't want to admit that it's beautiful in Canada and really is homesick for her life in Malaysia. Father was looking at a map of Waterton and suggesting other hikes we could do the next day, but mother said, "Ayo, we just did that hike today. Do we have to do another one?" "Sui Hua, each one is different. Don't you want to see more of what we saw today?" Father asked. "That was enough for me," mother replied. "How about a shorter one?" Father offered. "You can go with the girls if you want. I'll stay here." "But Mom," I interjected, "this is supposed to be a family vacation. You can't stay here. Besides, there's nothing fun to do here. Come on the hike with us." "It's just going to be more of the same," mother said. I thought about mother's superstitious ways. Maybe she felt there was some hong out there that wasn't right for her. After dinner, I could see mother and father in the distance. Mother was moving her arms wildly, and her father was looking at his feet. He raised his head, trying to interrupt. I felt my back clench. I hated seeing mother unhappy. The argument ended abruptly when she stormed off in the dusk. It was dark before she returned. She looked like Ikwi, the hungry ghost who roams the streets like a shadow, her long black hair resting over her shoulders and back, searching for sustenance but finding only what is rotten. When the light revealed it was mother, she was still sullen. We acted as if nothing happened and crawled into the van. As father snored, mother sat upright, stroking her ankle as if she had tested it too much during the day's hike. I fell asleep, watching her knead her foot with a steady force. So I chose that excerpt because it depicts the main character's mother as a ghost. And I've since childhood been fascinated with ghost stories and folk tales, mainly because my aunts were kind of superstitious growing up. Some of you might have grown up in families hearing your own stories and folklore. And there's particular ghost stories that get told over and over again. And, when I was younger, I thought they were really interesting and entertaining and frightening. But as I grew older, I began to realize that these stories told different kind of stories about things that you should be careful about or warnings and whatnot. And I toyed with this idea in my research, and it became a enduring theme through it. So my next book was called Ghost Citizens, and that the idea of a ghost kind of ignited for me as I was writing, the experience of stateless people is that a lot of them in my research told me, we feel like we're not really alive. We feel like we died administratively because there's no proof that they exist. They don't have any documentation to attest to their identity, attest to the fact that they are a person. So a lot of people, more than once, told me, I feel like a ghost. I feel like I'm in between life and death. I feel like I died at the government counter when they told me I wasn't in the system or I didn't have identity, or they took away my identification and said it was fraudulent. So all of these experiences, were depicted like ghost-like experience, like an experience of being a phantom. But I took the metaphor a little bit further because I started looking at legal case law. I started reading the ways in which administrative decision makers on paper communicated decisions to stateless people, but whether their citizenship applications were granted or not. And most of the time they were denied. And the reasons for why they were being denied were really interesting to me. So first of all, the term ghost citizen refers to two legal phenomena that I discovered in my research. The first is that states are denying people that technically, on the face of it, if you look at the law on its text, would qualify to be a citizen. But states would somehow say, no, you don't qualify, and find, very a variety of reasons to deny it, like you didn't complete this paperwork, or this isn't enough proof that you provided, or we simply don't believe you. And one of the main reasons that they provided to people was that, you actually are a citizen of another country, even though there was no documentary evidence or confirmation with another country that they were a citizen. So two things were happening in these legal encounters. The first thing is that states that people believed they were citizens of were telling them, you're not ours. So ghosting them. I know some of you, maybe this is dated now, but in the dating scene, it's very common for people to say, well, that person ghosted me. I never heard from them again. Well, states were doing this to their own citizens, people who would qualify in the law, but somehow the states are saying, no, we're not even going to acknowledge you. We're going to ignore your application. We're not even, so in some cases, they wouldn't even answer. And so they were ghosting their own citizens. And then on the other hand, when they did answer people, they would say, well, actually, you're a citizen of another foreign country. So I would call that conferring ghost citizenship, because they were conferring a citizenship that they had no power to confer. It's citizenship of another country. And they would say, well, you're not a citizen here. How could you be? Because you're a citizen of another country. And the way they would make that legal finding is by saying, oh, your mother is a citizen of Thailand, or your mother is a citizen of Vietnam. Your mother is a citizen of China. You couldn't possibly be ours because your mother is from somewhere else, and therefore you're a citizen of Thailand, you're a citizen of Indonesia, et cetera, et cetera. And so this whole ontological term of ghost citizen really comes from, my preoccupation with folk tales, with ghost stories, and with the lived experiences of stateless people who depicted their, traumatizing experience to move through life of being denied access to things like healthcare, education, even, identification, and being ghosted by their own states. So I'll read you an excerpt now from Ghost Citizens that kind of shows you how those motifs in my creative writing and the stories that I've heard growing up informed this practice. So when I was a little girl, I heard ghost stories. These were not the ghost stories you might have heard at summer camp around a fire. They were folk tales my aunties told that people feared and believed. They were told to teach lessons, but also to instill a respect of the unknown, our ancestors, and of things that may affect our fate. One of the most memorable stories told to me was of a woman ghost known as Pontianak. I remember this story because my auntie visiting from Southeast Asia was shocked to find a small banana tree as a plant flanking our bay window in the kitchen of my childhood home. She warned me that Pontianak likes to live in banana trees and that she is a vengeful spirit that can inflict bad luck on those around her. I never looked at that plant the same way again. Yuanben Li, Adrian, a scholar in communication and film studies, explains that the Pontianak is a widely recognized story. She is a most dreaded supernatural being in Malay folklore and mythology. Often described as a fearsome mythical creature with vampire-like qualities, she is said to have fangs, possess ghost-like traits, and can only be subdued using a sharp object, which is usually a nail, struck to the back of her neck. She is also recognized through her high-pitched shrieks, long flowing hair, and a fondness for the blood of children. Despite possessing such fearsome and horrifying characteristics, the Pontianak peculiarly remains popular among Malaysians and Asian audiences. Pontianak's story has been retold in folklore as that of a beautiful woman who died shortly after giving birth. And in some versions of the story, she died from the shock of hearing that her child was stillborn and then returns from the dead. She's the equivalent of the Western conception of the female vampire with her long black hair and long robe-like dress. Historical and modern sightings of Pontianak are frequent, with the attestations and videos shared on social media. The myth of how she died or why she has come back has evolved. She conjures fear with the bad luck she can bring, and the ways in which to avoid or kill this spirit in violent ways are frequently discussed. Adrian explains that Pontianak is a figure that transcends traditional belief in folklore and popular culture, manifesting in cinematic representations in horror films. He finds her popularity increasing because of social, cultural, and political anxieties. Adrian discusses how Pontianak emerged as a form of living dead, transgressing normative forms of proper behavior but asking for repentance. He notes, the Pontianak is a nebulous figure not only because of her existence as being neither dead nor alive, but also because of her ambiguous role, as it is not clear if she is a villain or hero. On one hand, she could be seen as a villain or antagonist due to the chaos, destruction, and murder of those regardless of their innocence. On the other, she could be read as a hero or the protagonist as she seeks justice for those who are oppressed. Pontianak haunted me in Malaysia while I was conducting field research. Friends would send me videos where wispy apparitions would be seen floating on a dark highway. The superstitious side of me held a respect for the warnings and stories. But the scholar in me also started to see a parallel between the lived experiences of stateless persons and Pontianak. I began to believe again, like I did as a child, that ghosts, living dead, were among us. So that is the introduction of the book that is coming out later on in February. And, you know, I think one of the reasons why I was drawn to that story is because in a lot of the legal cases I was looking at, the so-called foreign mother was always blamed for the statelessness of the child. And so Pontianak, in, as Adrian points out, is often depicted as a villain, someone who has done terrible things. And so in this case, mothers are always depicted as terrible mothers for not doing the proper things to acquire citizenship in the proper country for their children, or abandoning their children in a wayward foreign country, or being deceitful women who've tried to sneak their children into countries where they don't deserve citizenship, when in fact their fathers are Malaysian citizenships or Canadians who should also rightly be able to confer or be able to obtain citizenship for their children. I also, I think it's a powerful metaphor in the sense that the concept of statelessness is sometimes unbelievable. When I talk to people in different contexts, whether it's been through my novel or feedback that I've gotten at different public places about from my novel, it's been eye-opening for me to see that people have never heard of the term stateless before, that they never heard of someone not having citizenship anywhere. Even though that people might have been born to a place or reside in a place for a long time or have family or connections in a place, it's really unfathomable. And in a modern day, in our modern day, there are millions of people today that are stateless, millions around the world who are children, especially. And so I really wanted to have a powerful metaphor that would communicate to people how this existence as a stateless person is one that's difficult to understand because it's meant not to be seen. States don't acknowledge sometimes that this is a problem. We'll sometimes say, well, it's just a technical administrative problem that can be corrected easily. In developing countries just means resources that need to be put in place to identify persons and then correct it administratively through applications or paperwork. And my research shows that it's really more of a problem, as we've seen in our political times, about who deserves to belong in our communities. And so the final thing I want to kind of leave with you today is that beyond the technical problem of statelessness, I want people more than anything to understand that the majority of stateless people around the world are without citizenship because of their race, because of historical ideas about who belongs, because of colonial vestiges of laws that have been put in place about who deserves citizenship. And most of the time, it is people who are, racialized minorities in the countries that they happen to find themselves in. And most of the time, it is because there are ideas about national identity and what kinds of ways in which the community will grow and who's seen to be a positive feature in that community. And so most of the time I see, and my book talks about the fact that statelessness is not an accident. It's not an administrative foible. It's not isolated legal cases that happen to make it to higher courts or apex courts, but it's a systemic problem that is born out of very problematic racist discourse about who is deserving to be a member of our community, despite long-standing links, connections that people have. So I'm happy to discuss this more with people who might have questions about statelessness, about the creative process in terms of how that can inspire or motivate your research, and anything associated with that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the readings from both books and that really rich discussion. As we're waiting for questions to come in from the audience, maybe I can just open with one because I was thinking about Dandelion and the main character in Dandelion, Lily, and it's such an interesting book because you see as a reader these vignettes and conversations with Lily at different stages of her life. And you read from a passage where you're at Waterton in Alberta, but there's other points of the book where she may be in BC or in Ottawa, and ultimately in Malaysia. And I felt reading it, it was a very Canadian book, and at the same time, it takes you on this journey into some of the most complicated and painful experiences newcomers may have before they even arrive in Canada, and even intergenerational trauma. And it was making me think of Canadian lit and how different that book was reading that compared to the kinds of books that I read growing up that were deemed, sort of important Canadian books, because those were usually set within Canada. They didn't really have a travel component and so on. And so just to start off the discussion, can you speak to why it's important why it may be important in the Canadian context to have these kind of stories, including stories about statelessness?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Yasmeen. When I first set out to do this, I didn't know if I could write a novel, and I have to confess that I kind of was at an age where I'm like, I got to do this now or never, and I wanted to see if I could do it. And like you, I read a lot of Canadian literature growing up, and I felt like I never saw myself in any of those stories. Not only because they were always set in like big city Toronto or these very urban centers in Ontario. And I had never been to Ontario until I was an adult. So part of the reason why I wrote this book is to kind of, lay historical claim to some experiences outside of Ontario in some ways, and in small town, especially small town, and the immigrant experience there, but also a lot of the immigrant novels that I read growing up as well, celebrated hardship and perseverance and resilience, which I think that Dandelion does to some extent too. But I also wanted to acknowledge that it's not, as much as Canadian political landscape celebrates multiculturalism and the fact that we provide safe haven to a lot of migrants, it doesn't always feel that way to a lot of immigrants and migrants, that it can be very harsh. It can be very unwelcoming in some respects. And so I wanted to depict that. And as a immigration lawyer, you do see that. You see your clients have elation of obtaining their status, but then you see them struggle. You see them struggle getting a job, understanding what their kids are experiencing at school. You see them really struggling with, how society reacts to them publicly sometimes. So, all those things I wanted to share in this diasporic literature genre, so to speak, to say that, while in popular culture we celebrate the landing of refugees, the relief that some people may experience in obtaining status in Canada, the story is only beginning at that point, and that there's a lot of things that transpire that can affect someone's mental health, that can affect that children see everything and carry with them in their intergenerational trauma. The other thing is that there's not a lot of stories talking about how the idea of identity and belonging can really stay with you for a long time. And so in the story, a lot of stateless people I interviewed in my research, and I'm just witnessing my own father's experience, like you never feel secure ever. Yeah, once you're stateless, you always feel like that status could be like if you're given citizenship, you're lucky enough to have resolved your statelessness issues, that you feel like that citizenship status could be taken away from you for the rest of your life. And my father, as he's obviously very proud of where I am in my career, but he really hates when I speak publicly about anything, and he's always wondering, will that affect, my status as a Canadian citizen? And I see that with other people too. I've seen in my research some people asking me questions about, and I have to be honest, as a lawyer, we've seen trends where citizenship can be stripped from people for various reasons, including in Canada. And so it is a status that is not as permanent as we believe it to be. And I think that says a lot about the ways in which ideas of identity and belonging affect certainly migrants and racialized people differently, and that some of us take for granted that we're safe and can feel secure in that status, but other people don't, even though they might have currently citizenship at the moment.
Yeah, those are really compelling and interesting observations around how the status may stay with you even when you get citizenship. So we have a question that's kind of a clarifying one. Can you please clarify statelessness versus ghost citizen? Is it that a stateless person has no legal citizenship in any country, and a ghost citizen qualifies for citizenship but doesn't receive it?
That's a great question. Thank you. So, stateless is a term that refers to anybody who doesn't have citizenship whatsoever to any country. So, they might be within a country physically, but that country does not recognize them as a citizen, and they have no proof of that, no conferral. Ghost citizen, I use that as a term as a subgroup of stateless people. They are people that are within a country they consider their own, where they think they're a citizen of that country. And on the face of it, they do qualify for citizenship, but for a number of reasons, they don't have citizenship to that country. So in legal terms, they're called in situ. That's a Latin term, meaning they're in a place where, but they're not citizens of that place. So there are stateless people who are not in a country where they consider to be. So for example, there's people who might migrate to Canada and they're stateless, but they weren't born in Canada and they might have spent most of their lives elsewhere. So I'm talking about stateless people who are in a country where they have many connections, links, like they were born in that country, they have family there, they spent a long time in that country. And they still don't have citizenship. They've applied and been denied. So ghost citizens refer to that subgroup of stateless people. But the term ghost citizen also refers to the fact that the state is ghosting them. The state is denying them citizenship for a number of reasons. And it's referring to this legal practice that courts are saying, well, we don't have to look at your citizenship application because we believe you're a citizen of another country. It's kind of a deflection, a legal procedural error, in my view, where they're not even looking at the merits of a citizenship case and rather focusing on a speculative thing that you could be a citizen of another country and we're going to deny you citizenship here because we think you could get citizenship somewhere else. So I hope that clarifies things.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we have a question that is specific about Malaysia, and that is partly where where you did the research for the scholarly book that is coming out, but also one of the countries that the character Lily goes to. So the question's very specific about red ICs and whether you've heard that term. So the question is, through your work, have you heard about red ICs that were conferred in Malaysia after gaining its independence? If so, do you know why it was a thing?
Yeah, so my understanding is that red ICs are permanent residence cards. Like they would actually list on the back. I've seen like various kinds of documentations, but I would see that they were born in Malaysia, but for some reason they would just list them as permanent residents. And it would not necessarily mean that they were citizens. So I think that's what the person's referring to. Let me just say that there was a number, when Malaysia became independent, there, obviously a constitution was constructed and enacted, and most of the citizenship laws in Malaysia rest in the constitution. And it gave rules according to whoever was in Malaysia at that time, how they could obtain citizenship. And some people fell through the cracks because they didn't obtain citizenship immediately after Malaysia became independent. Following that, people would try to apply for citizenship, showing documentation of their residence in Malaysia prior to independence. And for some people, they were able to get citizenship. For others, they weren't. And so there is, a group of people who are now generationally stateless, even though they've had generational links of being in Malaysia for a very, very, very long time. And some of them are being deemed permanent residents, but not citizens. And that's a huge difference, because if you don't have citizenship, you're really unable to access a lot of the same government services or benefits. You can't really move out of the country because you can't obtain a passport. You'd have to, obtain an identification, and a lot of countries don't recognize stateless persons as having, will not grant them authorization to travel to their country without citizenship. So it's a huge problem. And if you can't substantiate citizenship of one person with a generational link, it's a domino effect. People, children, grandchildren will not be granted citizenship as a result.
Maybe just as a follow-up before I go to another audience question, that was a question very specific to Malaysia, but when you look at the different kinds of places people may be stateless, is the Malaysian experience one that is representative of what might happen in other locations or countries?
Yeah, so, while my case study in Ghost Citizens focuses on Malaysia, I do thread some examples from Canada. So I think the funny thing about this is that, Malaysia is a post-colonial state. It was colonized by the British. And anywhere you find where the British have been, their hierarchical and categorized ideas of race have really informed citizenship laws where they are, including Canada. So you see a lot of repetition in post-British colonial states and a lot of stateless populations have been born in post-colonial states this way because of the way that citizenship law is informed by the idea that there is a dominant racial population that benefits from citizenship, and then there's a kind of graduated system for other racialized minorities. And so I think, my hope is that some people see this term ghost citizen and see it being replicated elsewhere. I've seen it replicated, for example, in many places in the Middle East. In Canada, for example, I've pointed out to legal jurisprudence where courts here are also saying you're a citizen of India. How could you possibly be a citizen here? So it is, I would say, not an isolated practice, and that it is one that is that flows directly from historical ideas of who belongs and ideas of how citizenship should be crafted in law.
Okay, great. We have a question that takes up the issue of ghosts and the metaphor. And I might add to it a little bit because it sort of resonates with something I was wondering about. But the question is, ghosts are also capable of haunting and tormenting the living. How does that aspect of horror and a ghost's agency manifest? Does it to the state, to citizens, to the diaspora, etc.? And I want to just fill out the etc. and also specifically ask you, because you were talking about doing readings and other things, and people not having heard, a lot of people not having even heard the word statelessness. But to what extent is this taken up in the human rights community or the scholarly community? Is it being addressed sufficiently?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, yeah, I didn't have a chance to talk about this yet, but the back end of my book, Ghost Citizens, is dedicated to, what I witnessed were, resistance. Like, one of the things that I found so powerful about talking to stateless people is how they were insistent that they were citizens of the state that they were in, that they didn't just lay down and take what the state told them for granted. And they would be like, no, you're wrong. I am a citizen and you need to correct this. You need to recognize me in this way. And I'll give you an example. So for example, in Malaysia, you could become a citizen by being naturalized, i.e. applying to become a citizen. The other way is that you get an order or a declaration say, I am a citizen. Like I don't need to apply. I just need to show you some documentation to say, I was born here, or I have a Malaysian citizen. I qualify under the law, and you need to just give me documentation to say I'm a citizen. Most of the stateless people I talked to said, I don't want to apply to become a citizen. I am a citizen. I just need the state to give me the paperwork to say I am. And they would refuse to apply for naturalization, even though government officials at government offices and counters would say, no, 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 this is the application you need. And they would say, no, give me the right one. So a lot of my research was witnessing government people saying, actually giving them the wrong application and them going back to them and fighting and say, actually, no, I want the other application, and how government officials be denying them the application. And then they would come back with like lawyers or paralegals and insist on that application. So for me, that was a really rebellious act and an insistence that no, you might be trying to pigeonhole me in this route, but I'm telling you that this is who I am, and I want you to recognize me as that way. So that I think was, one of the most meaningful things that I saw, that stateless people are not, in development literature and in, I would say, NGO and UN circles, for a while there, some people would say, oh, it's because people were illiterate or uneducated, that's why they're stateless. But these people really showed that they understood not only their rights under the law, but they understood the complexities and nuances and insisted on the right application to be applied to them. Yasmeen, to your question, I would say that there is an emerging and growing body of people working on this issue around the world. A lot of them are legal scholars who are very attuned to tweaking the law. So there are, I would say, for sure, there is room to improve the law in ensuring people obtain citizenship. But for me as a lawyer, one of the big lessons from this research is that even if the law as text is perfect, what matters more is how it's implemented and interpreted. And in Canada and in Malaysia right now, like I feel like what matters more is not the tweaking of the law. That's very performative for me. And what matters more is how genuine or authentic or respectful interactions that state agents have with stateless persons. And to me, there aren't a lot of very respectful interactions, I would say. A lot of it is, I'll be crass. I witnessed at a government counter where someone would say, you don't look Malaysian, just by looking at their face. And so without looking at any of documentation. So I'll say that, there's a lot of work that has to be done in a social and cultural context about implementing the law in a way that is purposeful and intentional, in the ways that is respectful in the intention that it was meant to be enacted by. But it's not happening. And in Canada, certainly there is a lot of work that needs to be done on that front too, because people who have claimed to be Canadian citizens are starting to be deemed foreigners in law. And I think that is a very problematic practice that is not being challenged very much, I would say. So I think there's an emerging field of people engaged with this topic, but I think much more attention has to be paid, not to the tweaking of the law and the text, but how it is being interpreted and implemented.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful instruction on, the points where there might be change, and that it's not just simply a matter of the law, but other things that are going on at other levels. You were speaking about Canada, and we also have a question on Canada. And the question says, you said there are lots of stateless people in Canada. How did they get here, and how did they end up being non-citizens? What's the common method?
Yeah. So some of the cases that I'm kind of interested in right now, that I'm working on a broader statelessness project. So for example, there is a famous case of a person who was born of parents who have Indian citizenship, but were working for an Indian consular office at the time. So that fact is actually debatable and was before the courts. Were the parents enjoying diplomatic or consular status at the time when this person was born? This person believed he was a Canadian citizen for most of his life. His name is Abu-Laban, and he had Canadian passport, operated as a Canadian citizen for most of his life. Unfortunately, he got into conflict with the law. Went to prison and finished his sentence. But then when immigration officials started pursuing a stripping of his citizenship by saying, you're actually not a citizen. We're going to find you inadmissible, and we think you should be returned to India, even though he doesn't have Indian citizenship. This later created a lengthy litigation process where it was debated in the courts whether or not he was a Canadian citizen. The courts made a legal finding that his parents were of diplomats, even though they were employed as cleaners of a doctor who was employed at the Indian consulate, and deemed him not to be a Canadian citizen. They tried to deport him to India, but India told Canada that he's not a citizen of India. So he's living in limbo in Canada right now. And this is a very good example of someone who has very almost non-existent links to India, save for the fact that his parents might have Indian citizenship and never been to India, and is being deemed a foreign citizen of a country who has already told Canada that he is not a citizen of India. And so this is one famous case of statelessness. But I have to say, in my own research, there are a lot of cases of, for example, Palestinian persons who have tried to obtain refugee status. But I'll tell you, statelessness is not a reason that Canada gives refugee protection to people. And so a lot of people in that context are not given refugee protection. And in some of those cases, this is problematic practice where some of these people might have worked in Dubai or UAE, and they will say, well, that was your last place of residence, so where you've obtained permanent residence, so we'll consider that your country of origin. So there's these problematic ideas about where people are from and what kind of citizenship can be conferred on them without any proof. It's just speculative findings in law, which is really curious because lawyers and legal practitioners really adhere to evidence and proof. Another group that I'm fascinated with is Koreans. A lot of people who come from North Korea might come here to claim refugee protection, but then they're denied because they say, well, under South Korean constitutional law, you could obtain citizenship there, even though some of them have never been there before. So here's another case where people are being denied protection and legitimately need that protection, but then are being told you're actually a citizen of another country. So these are just a couple of examples of things that I'm seeing that potentially will come out of my writing in the future. But I would say they're kind of under the radar. There's a lot of attention in Canadian popular culture about refugees and how benevolent we are. But, at the first level, legal level, there's a lot of, I would say, gaslighting of people in terms of who they claim to be, and and the ways in which Canada deems them to be citizens of other countries in order to avoid giving them status such as refugee protection, status that they might actually merit,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to have to stay tuned to all your writings on this. I think we have time for one last question, and that is from the angle of this unusual combination of doing both a novel and a scholarly book. So they say your works are split between a creative press and a university one. How can a young scholar incorporate creative writing in their publications when academic journals expect nonfiction?
That's a really great question. So, when I wrote my novel, I didn't write it for an academic audience. And I think it's really important to think about how your work might provide an educational venue for people outside of academia. And so I see that work as, even though I put it in my academic CV and I do talk about it in an academic sense, The main reason why I wrote it is to communicate ideas and educate people about statelessness outside of academia. And that has been very effective, I have to say, and very rewarding for me to hear from people who say, I've never heard of this before, and I learned so much about that. So to kind of take that into context and say, well, not all the work that we do will be for academic journals. I will divulge that, Ghost Citizens had a bumpy ride to publication. The excerpt I wrote that I read to you, sharing my own personal connection to the issue of statelessness. Like, I didn't read you other parts, but I did share reflections I had about my father's own experience. And that was met with resistance by peer reviewers. Some of them said that maybe you should take out some of those personal references, and I resisted and pushed back. And I'll just say, as a scholar in Hawaii right now, there is a ton of scholars using narrative, using experiences of generational trauma or from their communities. And to me, it's a very interesting and powerful way to convey the ways, for example, in my research, the ways in which law is experienced or how it impacts people. So I would say, as a scholar, don't shy away from narrative as method, but be true to the don't isolate yourself with that as the only method that you use, I guess I would say. And I would say, how do you incorporate it in your practice? Like, writing this novel started with journaling. I would just sit and just journal. It started out as a journal, and then starting to put pieces together, and just having an ethic of writing as frequently as you can, even if it's not writing and reading as frequently as you can. And I think that's what every scholar does, right? But it's different, and experimenting with different forms of writing. But yeah, I sympathize, but I think it's important to have different forms of writing, to have different methodologies to turn to, and to be firm in your conviction that it's okay to use narrative as part and parcel of that work as well.
Well, thank you. That sounds like very sound advice, pragmatic, and yet also kind of pushing boundaries. So thank you for that. And thanks for taking the time to be here today, Jamie. It was wonderful to hear so much about the process of writing those books, and your insights on statelessness, which is such an important issue globally, and as you were telling us, also here in Canada. I just want to tell everybody that many more events are happening throughout the week that C3I has sponsored, and occurring in the International Week format. So they include an online talk tomorrow at noon on the environment and human rights, a 3 p.m. panel on children's rights tomorrow, and a 7 p.m. panel on refugees. So please check out the online program at uab.ca/iweek, and do join us again. Thank you so much.